Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Grace, and this is the KMG Show for Monday, October the 18th, 2021. So, I've been gone for, almost 3 weeks. Here's what happened. What happened is that after my last live stream went up, YouTube removed it and said that I had a strike against me, and that if I get another strike, then, very, very bad things will happen to me. Why was the show deleted? Because YouTube has decided that there are certain subjects that cannot be discussed. In particular, one medical subject of considerable importance to the world today. That there is one approved set of opinions on that, and that anything that is said that stands outside that is dangerous. And so it cannot be allowed. Now, I suppose this was the second time that I had been told by YouTube that there were certain things that could not be discussed. Another one would be a recent election in a foreign country. Previously, I remember having a stream struck down, just removed in the middle of recording it, because I had said something unkind about a certain Scandinavian climate activist. And before that, I believe, there was a stream which was just removed, just struck down right in the middle, because there was a certain so-called whistleblower with regard to the the conversation between Donald Trump and the Ukrainian president. So I thought about this, and I thought it's simply untenable for me to stay on YouTube, because they're simply looking for an excuse to ban me forever and eliminate my archive, my considerable archive of 375 shows or something like that. Now, so find an alternative system. Not that simple, actually, because I was determined to find an alternative system where anyone could comment. You wouldn't have to jump through hoops. And what I found, Odyssey, I believe Rumble, etc., that you need certain amounts of lemon points or something like that in order to enable commenting, chat. And I didn't want to do that, because it was obvious to me from the beginning that the chat is a very important part of this live stream. I know that a lot of people listen to it simply because they can chat, and because the kind of community has arisen amongst people who chat on the stream. So a person, I'll just identify this person as JK, said, well, why don't you do what another blogger does, which is to broadcast on YouTube and then download the video, put it on an alternative site, and then delete it from YouTube. So I figured out how to delete videos from YouTube, but the downloading the videos part, a little more difficult. There's various ways that it's suggested that this can be done, and I downloaded a program called 4K video platform or something like that. And I thought that I would download a test video at 720p, and that started about 3 hours ago, and it is less than halfway through. I don't know, perhaps I could download the videos in 240p. The video would look crummy, but we would still exist in an archived form. People talk about syncing accounts between YouTube and Odyssey. I'll get into that a little later, tonight, because as I say, I can't. The constraints that I'm laboring under are they're insupportable. Let's go to the chat Hello to Anrun, Gamiyun, Urban Planner, our valiant moderator, Chadson. Thank you for your service. Paul Picasso, 88, Justin Proto. John S. says, thought you were making an account on alternative platform. I have set up several accounts on alternative platforms, and I thought that DLive was probably the best bet because DLive enables chat. However, what happened is that, you are almost completed. You're almost authenticated on DLive, and we are sending you a link to click, and then everything will be hunky-dory. And I never got the link, and I requested it several times. I do not know what that is about. Hello to Chogokin 666 Lamprey Milt. The cable has left the building. The cable left the building quite some time ago, actually. Chogokin 666 says an extremely left female friend of mine got serious TDS, is lamenting the death of Colin Powell. I'll have something to say about him a little later. Hello to Professor Paul. Hello to John S., who says, I was going to give you a bunch of Odyssey coins to help you get set up. Also, we could sling real cash to you from there. I tell you what, though, I would prefer not to monetize my stream because then it would be a business. And once it becomes a business, then the tax man gets involved. But as far as the Odyssey coins go, that sounds very good. Because as again, you need coins to do certain things, I believe. Polygon says, remember when Colin Powell lied about sarin gas in Iraq? Have you looked into Trovo, says Chadson. I don't know what that is, but I'll tell you what, I will write it down right now in case I forget. So here's my notebook. And I will write Trovo here. There's another thing that's been going on, which is that, yesterday was the 10th anniversary, the 10-month anniversary of me living at this hotel, which has been progressively driving me mad. And this will, my father's will, which you may have heard me speak of, he died in May last year, early May, and the will was probated in February, and I still haven't got my money. Others have, about 10 other people have, but there are 3 people, and I'm one of them who have not got their money. This was supposed to have been, finished, wrapped up by the middle of October. Well, it is now a little past the middle of October, and it is not wrapped up, and the lawyer is now saying that this could take months more, which just seems, I don't know, unbelievable to me. And given that I was counting on some money in order to avoid being evicted on the 24th of this month, I don't know. I suppose I could get in touch with the lawyer, but he's not a very chatty person. You send him messages, or so I've been told, and then you don't hear anything for a long time. So I've got this, again, this sort of Damocles hanging over my head, about to fall on the 24th. And I have to say that the combination of, I don't mean to sound whinging here, but the combination of this bloat from YouTube and just the increasing insanity of this world, with everyone marching in lockstep, people wearing masks outdoors. This is the law, by the way, in the state of Oregon. Did you know that? I'll have something to say about Portland a little later. And no end in sight. Absolutely no end in sight. CNN is now joking, sneering about the before times. Yeah, the before times. It's never going to be what it was before. It's going to be good for us because, we're in charge. For everyone else, not so good. And of course, a lot of people are in the process of being fired, and shortly a lot more people are going to be fired because of this. Secular Coranism says if your YouTube channel is deleted, you can just start another channel, can't you? Well, another YouTube channel? I don't think so. I could start another channel, but I don't want to lose my backlog of episodes. Clear Sky says, standing shirtless in my dark kitchen, taking rips off a whiskey bottle and yelling KMG. Well, thank you. Come down to New Mexico. I have a spare room, says Professor Paul. I wouldn't be let into the United States because of my vaccination status. Chad Chadson says, considered smuggling KMG across the Puget Sound. Jonathan Paul answered my question working. He says, that's about the only Russian that I remember from my failed attempt to learn it. How's it going is essentially what I said, what that means. Hello to Tom Anderson. Library coin is what Odyssey uses. I understand you need so many to invade live streaming. Got you covered there, and you or listeners can boost your channel using it as well. Matt Forney, hello Matt, says Andy Nowicki has been banned from YouTube repeatedly. He just respawns on new accounts. And hello to Dustin Kekta. Now, there's something else that's going on, another sort of Damocles, if you like, hanging over my head, and not just my head. And I will refer here to a story at the National Post by Chris Selly from 3 days ago. The Liberals, that would be the Liberal Party of Canada, who won a minority victory in the recent election, didn't leave too many wedge issues on the shelf during the 36-day election campaign that ended with a barely altered status quo on September the 20th. Guns and abortion were taken out for a spin, with mandatory vaccination becoming an unwelcome new addition to the roster. But one issue that seemed sure to feature heavily never really got any action: the Liberals' proposed approach to policing a panoply of online harms, ranging from child pornography to terrorism promotion, hate speech, so-called hate speech, and non-consensual posting of illicit photos. No politician wants to spend 36 days defending terrorists, hate mongers, and pornographers. As the Manichaean language of campaigning would have it, the timing seemed obvious. The government only announced its intentions for an online harms, unquote, bill on July 29th, long after it had clearly decided to go to the polls. Too many people in Canada are victims of hate speech, which is often amplified and spread on social media, the Liberals' election platform argued. Selly responds, a foreign reader might have assumed Canada had no existing laws against hate speech. A re-elected Liberal government would make sure that social media platforms and other online services are held accountable for the content that they host, the platform vowed. And a technical paper released with a request for comments made clear what this approach would look like. Facebook, Twitter, and other platforms would have just 24 hours to address all content that is flagged by any person in Canada as harmful. Sully continues, the traditional Liberal wedge issues didn't seem to work so well against Conservative leader Erin O'Toole, but it would have been a serious test of his small c Conservative mettle, if he had opposed these people on freedom of speech grounds during a campaign. It is a remarkably small and dwindling constituency that thinks existing laws, the block button, and our inalienable freedom to log off social media forever, are sufficient to manage what goes on in the online cesspits. Something needs to be done. Most seem to agree. The only question is what. Even major Canadian media organizations, which are traditionally maximalist on freedom of speech, have launched campaigns to protect female journalists from the ludicrous levels of online abuse and vitriol many of them receive, though perhaps because of those traditions, those campaigns tend to be short on specifics as to what precisely to do about it. I'll break in here to say that Canadian media organizations and other media organizations in the world do not seem particularly upset by the extraordinary level of verbal and sometimes physical violence meted out to so-called TERFs. But I guess TERFs are very, very bad people, despite their championing by Dave Chappelle. I have to mention, I don't know, some of you may have noticed this, that Dave Chappelle used the term alphabet people in his most recent Netflix special. I was quite pleased with that. I believe I can claim coinage of that term. I don't expect a credit or applause for it. I would just like to see it amplified, as the kids like to say. So back to Chris Selly. Luckily for Aaron O'Toole, the Liberal approach is vulnerable to myriad criticisms without getting into the philosophy or the Constitution. Wherever one personally draws the line on free speech, the simple fact ought to be obvious: the Liberals' plan to target online harms would create an unholy mess. The general consensus among those who support a more heavily policed internet seems to be that Twitter's and Facebook's in-house attempts at cracking down on nasty content have been woeful even on their own timelines. The wrong users and posts get blocked and don't get blocked, perhaps at random or perhaps as part of a sinister agenda. Sarcasm is confused with sincerity. Parody is confused with attack. There's no proper appeals mechanism. There are endless examples of these failings. The Liberals' idea that creating a, quote, digital safety commissioner and surrounding the commissioner with a massive new bureaucracy would somehow improve things is simply laughable. What on earth would these people know about free speech that Facebook and Twitter don't? University of Ottawa law professor Michael Geist, a relentless critic of the Liberal government's anti-internet agenda, argues correctly that imposing these requirements on social media giants would cause them to automate or further automate their responses to flagged content. And we know that automation leads to outcomes that infuriate the very people calling for this sort of regulation. There is no question that the Liberals' imagined regime would lead to absurd outcomes, many of which would dismay Liberals. The party caught a glimpse of its potential future during the campaign when Twitter flagged a video posted on Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland's account as, quote, manipulated media. Partisans were aghast. Not us, you lunatics, the other guys. If the Liberals create an actual legal obligation for Twitter or Facebook to police its content along those lines, you can be 100% certain their opponents will be flagging every unkind thing they see, and their partisans would be doing the same in return, and a famous schmozzle would ensue. If O'Toole and his front bench can convince the Liberals and Canadians at large just how misguided this proposed legislation is, it will go down as a sad moment in this country's democracy. Hopefully, at least, it would just go down as another Liberal policy failure and not as a serious erosion of Canadians' freedom of speech. Well, Canadians don't have much in the way of freedom of speech. As I have pointed out repeatedly, the Supreme Court ruled quite a few years ago that truth is not a defense to the accusation of hate speech. Yes, that's right. Truth is not a defense. And it is suggested that the Liberals may bring in legislation requiring people on social media to register with the government, to get a license from the government to proffer opinions on social media. Yes, it may be the case that in Canada, that if you have something spicy to say about Kanye West, covering his head and neck with a blindingly white plastic mask, you're going to need the government's approval to do so. Now, there's no question if this were instituted and these other online harms provisions were instituted, that I would be gone. And many other people would be gone as well. In a way, it doesn't really matter whether the government brings forward this legislation, because the whole trend of Canadian social life for decades now has been shut up or you will know the reason why. the Canadian media had something of a crazy fit over Maxime Bernier, the leader of the People's Party. After the election results were tallied, Bernier's party did not win a single seat. However, he did receive over 800,000 votes, about 5% of the total. And I would think that if you live in a country, or if you are one of the elite of a country where mildly, let's say, diverse opinions such as that of Maxime Bernier have been so demonized that only 5% of Canadians will vote for it and they won't win a single seat, you would feel pretty pleased with yourself. But the Canadian elite and the Canadian governments are determined to extirpate all political dissent. I mean, that may sound like hyperbole, but it is not. It's a piece by the Western Standard from last month. The mainstream media is supporting the Liberal plans to censor the internet when it comes to hurtful words about the media, says Blacklock's reporter. This is not about limiting democratic expression. Paul Deegan, CEO of News Media Canada, wrote in a submission to the Department of Canadian Heritage. It is about protecting it and its most precious guardians, journalists. And it is about ensuring all publishers, including internet intermediaries, are held accountable for harmful content. Cabinet has said it will reintroduce Bill C-36 that lapsed in the last Parliament. This bill would ban legal online content, quote, likely to foment detestation or vilification of an individual or group, unquote, under threat of $70,000 fines or house arrest. News Media Canada endorsed the censorship bill. As a business, the news publishing industry remains under threat from the unregulated and unchecked social media and other online communication service providers, wrote Deegan, formerly a lobbyist for CN Rail. Deegan says the bailout press faces harassment, defamation, and threats, but provided no examples. Our journalists, including female and Black, Indigenous, and people of color journalists, and our customers face online harm, he wrote. Let's see. Yes, why would this be so? Because the people who are in journalism now are largely worthless people and also creeps on top of it. But wait, there's more. News Media in Canada in 2019 successfully lobbied Parliament for amendments to the Income Tax Act that created a $595 million press bailout fund. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot of money, but keep in mind that Canada is a small country by population. Media approved by the cabinet are entitled to payroll rebates of up to $13,750 per newsroom employee and 15% tax credits for subscribers. Our approach will not be to bail out industry models that are no longer viable, said then Heritage Minister Mélanie Joly. Yes, so there's $595 million. And just before the last election, Trudeau came up with another $51 million, which was handed out to approved media organizations. Well, follow the money, as they say. And speaking about influence peddling, there was a hilarious story in the New York Times, October 4th, called Hungary's Leader Fights Criticism in U.S. Via Vast Influence Campaign. Former Vice President Mike Pence turned up in Hungary last month to speak to a conference on conservative social values hosted by the far-right government of Prime Minister Viktor Orban. Jeff Sessions, the former Attorney General, was another recent visitor. Tucker Carlson did his Fox News show from Hungary for a week this summer. The American Conservative Union is planning a version of its CPAC gathering in Budapest early next year. Those are among the more visible recent fruits of a well-funded campaign by Orban in the United States that stretches back a decade and now stands as a case study in how governments around the world seek to shape policies and debates in Washington, sometimes raising concerns about improper foreign influence in U.S. politics. So the Hungarians are coming. Much of what the Hungarian network has done is legal and standard operating procedure in Washington, but some of its activities touch on gray areas, including transparency requirements for those acting on behalf of foreign interests, concerns arising from overseas efforts to sway presidential campaigns, and the ethics of think tanks accepting money from governments or their proxies. Want to talk about governments? Whatever influence Hungary and Viktor Orban are peddling in America are tiny, minuscule compared to many other countries. And to name just three, let's see, China, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. But strangely, this New York Times article doesn't go into that. Nor does the name Hunter Biden appear, because Hunter Biden was peddling influence for the Ukraine, which is a basket case of a nation and a very strange country, being as it is a coalition between Jewish oligarchs and neo-Nazis, real neo-Nazis, the kinds with guns and, battalions. But no, we don't want to talk about that. Let's go back to the chat. Okay, what else do we have here? Yeah, Hungary, that great manipulator of global opinion, says Steve. John S. says, our society is now truly transparodic. It's now impossible to determine if a news story is real or parody. Hello to Dan Allison. Contracu says, oi, you got license for that opinion, Gov? You need to denounce matriarchy, says secular Coronism. I've been denouncing it for quite a long time. Paul Racine says the world is a more interesting place with KMG in it. Well, thank you for that. Chappelle watches KMG Show confirmed. The KMG butterfly effect, says Steve. I don't know what that refers to. Cognitive Dissonant says Odyssey heavily promotes their YT cinch figures. Pretty sure JF Garepi archives all his shows there and deletes any problematic content from YT. Kevin, could you tell me which episode of Theater Thursday has the Wicker Man? Okay. Well, I can give it a go here if everyone is prepared just to wait for just a little minute. That would be September the 19th, 2019. So to the extent that it exists, it'd be on Luke Ford's archive somewhere. September the 19th, 2019. So let's talk about the supply crisis in the United States, or the transportation constipation, as I have dubbed it. What is causing it? It seems to be a mystery. It's not really a mystery at all. There's two reasons for it. The just-in-time delivery system, which is one of the things that Taleb has been warning us about for a long time. There's no surplus. There's no inefficiency built into the system, and it works wonderfully and delivers low prices until there is a shock. But as we know, planning for shocks, why would anyone do that? Because we've worked out all the bugs in the system and nothing untoward is ever going to happen again. And the second reason for this is explained by Sundance at the Conservative Treehouse. Hundreds of requests for details on the specifics of the container shipping backlog. So I spent 3 days calling sources, digging for details, and gathering information on the substantive issue at hand. The epicenter of the problem is not what is being outlined by financial media, corporate media, and politicians who have a specific interest in distracting from the issues at hand. This has nothing to do with COVID-19. The issues being discussed today relate to events that happened a long time ago. As a matter of fact, it was so predictable that Amazon, Walmart, UPS, FedEx, Samsung, the Home Depot, and Target all had taken actions years ago, long before COVID, because they knew this day would come. It was not accidental that those companies showed up at the White House to discuss the issue, because there's now a full court press to hide it. There is one very specific regional issue driving the problem. The trucking issue with California ports, LA ports, i.e. the Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach, is that all semi-tractors have to be current with new California emission standards. As a consequence, that means trucks cannot be older than 3 years if they are to pick up or deliver containers at those ports. This issue wipes out approximately half of the fleet trucks used to move containers in and out of the port. Operating the port 24/7 will not cure the issue because all it does is pile up more containers that sit idle as they await a limited number of trucks to pick them up. This is the central issue. On October 16, 2020, the EPA reached a settlement agreement with California Air Resources Board to shut down semi-tractor rigs that were non-compliant with new California emission standards. From the press release today, the EPA announced settlements with 3 interstate trucking companies imposing $417,000 in penalties for violating the California Air Resources Board's federally enforceable truck and bus regulation, drayage truck regulation, and transport refrigeration unit regulation. As trucks are one of the largest sources of air pollution in California, EPA will continue to ensure these heavy-duty vehicles have the needed pollution control equipment and operate in compliance with the rules. And Sundance argues, in effect, what this 2020 determination and settlement created was an inability of half the nation's truckers from picking up anything from the Port of LA or Port of Long Beach. Virtually all private owner-operator trucks and half of the fleet trucks that are used for moving containers across the nation were shut out. In an effort to offset the problem, transportation companies started using compliant trucks, low emission, to take the products to the California state line where they could be transferred to non-compliant trucks who cannot enter California. However, the scale of the problem creates an immediate bottleneck that builds over time. It doesn't matter if the ports start working 24/7, they are only going to end up with even more containers waiting on a limited amount of available trucks. Yes, and we have some action from Joe Biden on this, which is pretty funny. Yeah, let's bring in a general. Let's bring in a retired lesbian general, and she'll take care of this. Because, of course, right? That is exactly who you want. Yesterday afternoon, President Biden announced his intention to nominate Rear Admiral Ann Phillips, U.S. Navy retired, as the next U.S. Maritime Administrator, a position that has been vacant since Rear Admiral Mark Busby stepped down following the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol in January. Phillips is a highly decorated Navy leader with a long list of accomplishments and is highly respected by everyone. She was, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. However, this is from gcaptain.com. The appointment looks great on paper, except for one kind of big problem. This is not a warship position. It's a commercial shipping appointment, and she has zero experience aboard any commercial ships. She does not even have experience leading Navy military sea lift ships. However, she is a woman and a lesbian, and that should make the difference. Let's go to Jim Kunstler's column. Today it is called Let Us Count the Ways. What America really wants to know is, after those months of family leave, did Pete Buttigieg get the hang of lactating? If sexuality is just a so-called social construct, then the functions of sexuality must be teachable. So now Pete can move on to ovulation lessons and become the birthing person of his dreams. Pete's dreams are America's dreams, you see. In the meantime, though, America has a little transportation problem that a Secretary of Transportation might look into if he wasn't so busy performing a gender re-education parable for the woke family values crowd. Namely, that federal rules combined with California Air Resource Board regulations are destroying the trucking industry, a major link in the broken supply chain for the gazillion products and parts that an advanced technological economy needs to keep on keeping on. Under the rules, for example, California wants to phase out tractor-trailer rigs more than 3 years old and eliminate all trucks that run on fossil fuels by 2035. Now, it happens that most of the truckers who service the ports of Southern California are independents. They have to buy their own rigs, on which many make the equivalent of a mortgage payment because a semi-rig can cost as much as a house. Of course, the rig must be allowed to operate for the duration of the loan. The new government regulations cancel that financial formula, and with it, the trucking industry. So much for the good intentions of the eco-wonks. Secretary Pete might have paid attention to the developing trouble at the shipping container ports in late summer and started an emergency review of those untenable rules and regs. But instead, while learning the ins and outs of chest feeding, he allowed the system to break down. The reality spinners in the Joe Biden news media would like you to think that the breakdown only applies to Christmas swag for the hoi polloi. No inflatable Frosty the Snowman for you this year, you deplorable insurrectionist gorks in your sad little towns out in the flyover gloaming. Actually, it applies to most of the things even super hip wokesters need every day in the normal course of things, and especially the replacement parts for all the engines and machines that American normality depends on. Plus, the situation has already moved into food supplies, and now that it's all broken, the shortages may persist as far ahead as anyone can see. And then Kunstler has something to say about the latest developments regarding a certain disease, which I'm not allowed to talk about here. But he has some other things to say. In the course of an average day, do you ever think about all the people from around the world who are jumping the U.S.-Mexican border? It's thousands of them each day and millions piling in over the year 2020 under the averted eyes of Joe Biden and company. Some of them are criminal opportunists who, how shall we say, aim to blow shit up in the country. Can you blame genuine U.S. citizens from regarding this as an affront to common sense and common decency, not to mention an insult to the law and the Constitution behind the law? Well, it is, since it's the federal government's duty to control entry across the border, and since Joe Biden directed the Border Patrol to not perform its duties, would you be surprised if the citizens develop the notion that they will have to defend the borders themselves? Do you think economic collapse will make any of this better? As winter looms, you'll have plenty of time to mull that over, all bundled over in your kitchen with the propane tanks empty and the last can of cold SpaghettiOs in your gloved fist. When the time comes for that, don't expect Joe Biden to be reading Thanksgiving homilies off his teleprompter. He will be gone, and the Democratic Party horse he rode in on with him. And when that time comes, we will be ready to start stitching things back together again in this land, perhaps a bit differently than the way we've gotten used to. Be patient and brave. Our time will soon be at hand, Kunstler concludes. I found out a couple of days ago that the creeps at Chapo Trap House, or whatever it's called, have been gleefully talking about treats. Oh, you horrible people aren't going to get your treats anymore. Again, these people have no idea how transportation works, how economies work. And as Kunstler pointed out, it's going to be a lot more than, treats that are going to be unavailable. I suppose they'll be quite shocked when this happens. Of course, one might, consider other things that have been allowed to happen. Taiwan and chips. Yeah, sure, let's let Taiwan make all the chips. They used to fabricate computer chips in Texas, of all places. But no, let's let Taiwan do it. And what happens if there's a war between Taiwan and China? Or what if China says to Taiwan, we're not going to invade you just yet, or, maybe blow you to smithereens with our new hypersonic weapon, but here's a list of things that we want you to do. For instance, choke off the supply of computer chips to the United States of America. But more on Pete Buttigieg, who gives the impression of having been decanted in a McKinsey laboratory. This fellow ran for president, Okay, he's gay. That's it. That was the whole thing. He's gay. It proved to be unavailing, But of course, he failed upwards and is now Secretary of Transportation. It's a really remarkable thing that this man went on leave for 3 months, and the nation was kept in the dark. Now, of course, one could ask about the news media. Why aren't we hearing a lot from Pete Buttigieg about this growing crisis in California? Hmm? Hmm? Is he otherwise engaged? As it turns out, he was, but they don't want to embarrass Pete. This is from Caitlin Corral at the Daily Mail. Pete Buttigieg rebuked conservative criticism over taking parental leave in the midst of a supply chain crisis after adopting twin newborns, as the transportation secretary claimed paid leave to take care of family is still work. Yes, indeed, raising newborns is work. However, it is not the work that Pete Buttigieg is being paid to do. Oh, what a charming story. Did you see that picture of him and his husband, Chasen? Chasen, who changed his surname to Buttigieg. And there they are lying in a hospital bed, side by side, clutching a baby apiece and staring lovingly into each other's eyes. Of course, two men cannot make babies. So Pete and Chasen managed to procure these children somehow. Details, strangely enough, unavailable. It sounds awfully like these celebrity homosexuals are buying children, but that couldn't be true because the sale of children is illegal in the United States. So just put that out of your mind. And apparently they're getting up at all hours, feeding these babies. As you might imagine, we're bottle feeding and doing it at all hours of the day and night. Buttigieg explained to CNN's State of the Union on Sunday, and I'm not going to apologize to Tucker Carlson or anyone else for taking care of my premature newborn infant twins. Couldn't Chasen take care of that all by himself? I'm sure that Pete is not short of money. A nanny could be hired. Buttigieg is rearing to Carson, dismissing him. Rearing? I don't... That's what it says in the Daily Mail. Reacting, I suppose it's supposed to be, to Carlson dismissing him on Friday after making a joke the day before about him taking parental leave, which the Fox News host sarcastically says was made in error. Quote, last night on the show, we made a brief offhand joke about the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, and this morning we discovered our error, Carlson said. It turns out that Buttigieg is not a dwarfish fraud whose utter mediocrity indicts the class that produced him. No, not at all. Pete Buttigieg was once the mayor of South Bend, Indiana. So understandably, going forward, we're under strict orders from the Biden administration to take Pete Buttigieg very, very seriously. And of course we will. Our mistake. Unquote. Look, paid family leave is important, Buttigieg said. It's important as a matter of family values. It's important to our country. And one more thing that I think is maybe underappreciated. I've always hated this term family values, and I always saw it, well, at least going back to the 1990s, as a Trojan horse, because values are mutable, whereas truths are not. So now we're supposed to applaud Pete and Chasen, as I say, a rich couple who somehow managed to procure what I believe are 2 white babies, which are very, very rare for adoption in the United States. When somebody welcomes a new child into their family and goes on leave to take care of that child, that's not a vacation. It's work. It's joyful, wonderful, fulfilling work, but it is work. Buttigieg says, I should think that sheen would wear off that very quickly indeed. Women, when their children are distressed, a hormone is produced. No such hormone is produced by men because it is not the primary job of men to raise children, particularly newborn children. Yes, we're on the subject of collapse, aren't we? I believe. Before we get into that directly, there's an essay by Sam Dexter today at the American Sun called "A Nation of Domestic Terrorists." The security state has identified the newest terror threat to America. The Department of Justice has announced it shall investigate anti-CRT parents as domestic terrorists. This kicked off outrage, and one U.S. senator has demanded answers. Will there be any action from GOP governors is an important question yet to be answered. Welcome to the era of the domestic war on terror. Anyone expressing skepticism or disagreement will have the full array of government tools applied to them. The casus belli in this front is aggressive threats from parents. At the core of the teachers begging for protection and application of anti-terrorism protocols is the mind-boggling odyssey that one parent in Loudoun County endured. There is no argument, only enforcement, harassment, and punishment for those who disagree. I don't know whether you're familiar with the story from Loudoun County. Daily Wire, Loudoun County schools tried to conceal sexual assault against daughter in bathroom, father says. Father in viral video, school board arrest, says his daughter was raped in school bathroom. Raped by a trans person, it would seem. Juvenile records are sealed regarding Smith's ninth grade daughter, but Smith's attorney, Elizabeth Lancaster, told the Daily Wire that a boy was charged with 2 counts of forcible sodomy, 1 count of anal sodomy, and 1 count of forcible fellatio related to an incident that day at the school. So, yeah, a woman wearing a rainbow heart shirt, but of course, said that she did not believe. Told Smith she did not believe his daughter. His rage reached a boil, and he had a heated exchange of words with the woman. A police officer there to keep the peace in the meeting pulled on his arm. Yes, he was handcuffed, dragged away, arrested. Because suppressio veri is necessary when a leading member of the alphabet people is accused of a heinous act, because we know that those things never happen. They're conspiracy theories, despite what we found at that Korean spa in Los Angeles, where a female penis was being waved around in front of children, and we were assured that it was all made up. And then we discovered it was not, in fact, all made up. But back to the American Sun and Sam Dexter. The left calls anti-CRT groups astroturf. There is some truth to this, but all political movements are. This is an outgroup astroturf, so it is bad, unlike Black Lives Matters. These are concerned parents that got to witness via Zoom their children's education in 2020. Some organizations started as concerned over the gender and sexuality messaging in schools. The CRT wave has added a new flood of angry parents. Are they terrorists? No. This does not stop the methods of harassment experienced by politically engaged individuals from being applied to normal Americans, like stay-at-home moms and engaged dads. Organizers are doxxed, have their employers harassed, are sued by well-funded nodes of left-wing power, and experience threats from left-wing activists or the growing volunteer thought police. This ratchets up tension in a nation already tense and politically divided within communities over COVID compliance and enforcement. This is an abuse of the idea of anti-terrorism strategies and enforcement, but effective. It has a chilling effect on engagement, and for those deemed a danger to the education system enough, targets of federal scrutiny and harassment. This is very dangerous for organizers and even ground-level volunteers. With the FBI, DOJ involved, expect a flood of infiltration ops and agents provocateurs to make these parents look bad. They will serve their purpose and disappear, just like the MAGA bomber in 2018. No one should be harassed for wanting a say in their child's education. There is an upside, however. These parents are labeled domestic terrorists and oftentimes called proponents of white supremacy. As the accusation of racist lost effect and anti-white racism grew in prominence, the label racist was going to be replaced, and very quickly we see the results. Labeling these parents terrorists or white supremacists, who are obviously neither, lessens the power of the label and also creates a problem for the globalist regime. It's a curious thing that's happening in America. I suppose one of the differences between America and Canada is that a significant amount of dissent still exists in the United States of America, whereas 5% of the Canadian population voting for a rather mild right-wing reformer is seen as the occasion for panic stations. But Joe Biden's decision, to the extent that he is capable of making any decisions, to essentially declare war on half the population of his country, well, it's unprecedented. Well, certainly unprecedented since 1865. I wonder what the end game is there. I don't really understand it myself. There's a essay by the Z-Man, which I quite liked, I suppose because one of the things he says is one of the things that I've been saying for some time, that, there's a lot of ruin in a nation, as Adam Smith said, right? Well, yeah, true, there is. But it happens quite often that things just collapse very quickly, and the collapse of the Soviet Union is one of my favorite examples in this regard, because pretty much right up to the end, the CIA, Paul Samuelson and other worries were saying, oh no, the Soviet Union is it's solid. And in fact, probably by 2025, the Soviet economy is going to surpass the American economy. But all loyalty had been drained in the Soviet Union. Many, many jokes. My favorite being, I'm sure you've heard it, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. I suppose with UBI, we're not even pretending to work, but we still get paid pittance. And the Z-Man has a column, October the 14th, called Lessons from Collapse. When the Soviet Union collapsed, it did not descend into chaos or have a long period where no one was in charge. It was a process that began with the power struggle between Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin. This power struggle undermined the power of the party and eventually the government. Into the void flowed a new source of power and authority, the oligarchs. These were men with control of key assets who backed Yeltsin's privatization plans for the economy. Those oligarchs did not spring from nothing. Some were key party figures who had controlled aspects of the Soviet economy, but most were privateers who operated in the shadow economy of the Soviet system. They held posts in the Soviet system but had extensive contacts in the criminal underground. As the power of the state declined, the power of the underworld economy grew. When the system collapsed, they became the power centers providing control of the country. This was not unique to the Soviet system. When power begins to wane, alternative centers of power begin to flourish. There is a period in which the real power exists in these distributed power centers, but the facade of the old system remains. Collapse is merely the formal recognition of reality. Germany in the interwar years is another example of what happens when there is a power vacuum. The fascists did not spring from nothing. They had roots in German history and culture. And then he goes on to talk about the collapse of the Roman Empire, which I will touch on a little later. Many of those oligarchs in Russia were just the guys who noticed it first, that is to say, the impending collapse. Mikhail Friedman was active in the underground economy in the later years of the Soviet Union and quickly moved to the newly privatized economy as soon as it was possible. Like most of the oligarchs, he was an early adopter who saw the writing on the wall. In other words, the men who would eventually become the oligarchs after the fall of communism were the first to see that the old system was doomed and something else was coming to replace it. They did not know or care what was coming. They just wanted to profit from the chaos. In fact, when the opportunity arose, they promoted the chaos, backing Yeltsin over Gorbachev because it was good for business. They profited from the collapse before anyone saw the collapse coming. In current year America, Z-Man writes, this is relevant because it suggests that the American empire has been in collapse for a long time now. The rise of the financial oligarchs in the late 1980s and 1990s was one sign. The rise of Silicon Valley oligarchs as a rival power center to Washington is another. The assault on small business and the middle class by the combined power of the oligarchs and the political class is analogous to the late years of the Soviet system. In other words, the American empire may already be in collapse. The geezers in Washington are allowed to pretend they are in charge as it benefits the oligarchs, but they have no real power. Legislation is written by the army of scribes known as lobbyists and think tanks underwritten by the oligarchs. Elections are determined by the money and media supplied by those same oligarchs. The real power lies in boardrooms and villas, while the political system is just a show. Historical analogies are never perfect and are useful only in comparing the broad outlines of times and places. A smooth landing for the empire is not guaranteed any more than Caesarism is a certainty. The military could blunder the empire into a war it cannot win and destroy its credibility in the process. A financial collapse could lead to a popular revolt against the oligarchs. Of course, there is the looming demographic crisis that will bring unimaginable social upheaval. Even so, Zeman concludes, what history is telling us is that the American empire is well past the point where reform is possible. It is past the point where the decaying system of imperial control can expect to outlive its current operators. The system is on life support, and powerful interests are evolving in response to this reality. The collapse is now certain, but the timing is what is unknown. Another lesson of history here is that no one saw the Soviet collapse coming. The end is always a surprise. As another example of collapse, I could point to just the absolutely extraordinary events that have transpired in Portland, Oregon over the last 2 years. And I see a story here from Sarah Klein of the Associated Press. And could the American media actually be interested in what is going on in Portland? Lawless city, worry after Portland police don't stop chaos. A crowd of 100 people wreaked havoc in downtown Portland, Oregon this week, smashing storefront windows, lighting dumpsters on fire, and causing at least $500,000 in damage. But police officers didn't stop them. Portland Police Bureau officials say that's because of legislation passed by Oregon lawmakers this year, which restricts the tools they can use to confront people vandalizing buildings and causing mayhem. The reason that we did not intervene goes back to what we talked about last month with House Bill 2928 and the restrictions placed on us in a crowd control environment. Coin reports that Portland Police Lieutenant Jake Jensen said in a neighborhood meeting Thursday. Does this mean that we are now like a lawless city? Linda Witt asked during the meeting with police. Jensen replied, saying people can still face consequences later. We all know what's happened in Portland, that Antifa goes berserk, attacking property and people. They get arrested, and then they are immediately released on their own recognizance. The legislation in question is House Bill 2928, which prohibits the use of things like pepper spray and rubber bullets for crowd control. However, there is an exception when the circumstances constitute a riot and if the officer using the chemical incapacitant reasonably believes its use is necessary to stop and prevent more destructive behavior. Seems to me that the police in Portland have decided that discretion is the better part of valor because they don't want to be arrested and charged with crimes which could send them to jail for years or perhaps the rest of their lives, particularly if they intervene with a POC rioter. On Tuesday, police say 35 separate locations were targeted, including banks, retail stores, coffee shops, and government buildings. The Daily Mail has something on this. Antifa rioters tore through the city following a memorial for an activist killed in October 2019 whose mother organized the protest and called it a night of rage and anger. Obviously, righteous rage and anger. If you look at the cities on the west coast, if you will, of North America, you find strikingly similar situations. The people who live in Victoria, where I live, in Vancouver, and Seattle, and Portland, and San Francisco, and Los Angeles have pretty much decided, at least in the majority, to just let civilization burn. Because they just couldn't stand the feeling that they had been mean to people who were possessed of righteous rage and anger. But of course, what we learn from the regime media is not the world as it exists, not even close. I'm going to recommend an essay in at the American Mind or AmericanMind.org called "Reclaiming Representation" by Adam Ellwanger. In an excerpt from his speech winning the Cold Civil War, Claremont Board Chairman Thomas Klingenstein expertly describes the institutional collusion that imposes a radical left paradigm on American society at large. Further, he clarifies how matters of identity, race, class, gender, and sexual orientation, weasel words, sexual orientation, it means nothing. Why are people still using this? I know why, because again, it's a Trojan horse. Are used as wedge issues to create public discord, which undermines any unified effort by the American people to resist the new ideological order. Democrats have often fixated on representation in media and government. They demanded that these entities should look like America. At that time, the television did not seem to depict an America as diverse as it really was. In politics and the white-collar professions, white men were statistically overrepresented, evidence that the historical privileges accorded to majority groups endured even after the sweeping victories of the civil rights movement. It was possible, without relaxing the standards of meritocracy or the norms of representative government, to acknowledge that America was more diverse in real life than it looked on TV. Well, there's a reason for that. And the reason is that the white majority in the United States was simply not interested in watching TV shows and movies about black people. This was, as it were, forced on them. If it had been up to them, TV today would still look like TV in the 1950s or early 1960s. So then he goes on, Ellwanger goes on about inclusivity. After 2000, though, things began to change. Slowly but surely, it was less about an accurate representation of demographic groups according to their presence in the general population and more about equality, pure and simple. Whereas in the decades prior, it was said that a group that makes up 13% of the population should make up 13% of various statistics and institutions. A new demand rose. Roughly speaking, there are 5 major racial categories in the U.S.: whites, blacks, Hispanics, Asians, and other. Under the new paradigm, each of those groups should represent a 20% of any given metric, regardless of their share of the general population. If there are 2 marital statuses, married and unmarried, each category should represent 50% of a given metric, regardless of their share of the general population. Does anyone believe that if only 67% of Congress was comprised of white people, that the left wouldn't still be clamoring for more diversity? Watching a few hours of any primetime network television lineup will provide ample evidence of this phenomenon. For example, the cast of a program will rarely be made up of 65% white people, 15% Hispanics, 13% black people, and a smaller share of Asians and other groups, reflecting the approximate reality of U.S. demographics. Instead, a show with 10 major characters will have roughly equal numbers of men and women, but one character will be white, one black, one Hispanic, one member of the alphabet community, one Asian, one Muslim, etc. A careful study of network television commercials will yield an even more pronounced finding. For example, whites are wildly underrepresented as the main characters in commercials relative to their share of the general population. In the current context, then, the representation of diversity isn't really a representation at all. Rather, it is a moral imaginary, a kind of dreaming about what a better America would look like. Why is it better? Because in the fantasy world of leftist politics, minority status is synonymous with experiencing injustice. In short, the crime isn't underrepresentation of a minority group. It is the existence of any group as a minority. Therefore, true social justice would demand that there is no minority, only a uniform diversity comprised of precisely equal shares of every identity category you can imagine. Well, I'll say this. I think it's worse than what Adam Ellwanger has to say. What we're seeing, and it is even worse in Canada than in the United States, considering what Canada's demographics are. According to the last census, now this number is going to increase maybe from 3.5 to 4.5 or even 5%. But that's how few blacks there are in Canada compared to the United States. If you watch Canadian television commercials, as I do, you would get the impression that somewhere between 30 and 50% of Canadians are black. These commercials, interracial relationships, of all sorts. Now, when I walk on the streets and I see interracial relationships, they're almost always the same: a white man and an Asian woman. I see very little example of any other kind of interracial relationship, certainly on the streets of Victoria, but in Canadian television commercials, it is absolutely ubiquitous. And there's a message here, and the message is this: the Great Replacement, it's over. It's happened. You lost. Now hurry up and die. That is the message. Why would ad agencies, companies be interested in this? Well, mimetic desire, as they call it. Everyone else is doing it, so we are going to do it as well. The point of this is to break the spirits of anyone who might resist the Great Replacement. Again, because apparently it's already happened. Let's go back to the chat. Okay, here we go. Jonathan Pohl says, here we have white Hispanics. Indeed, there are a great many white Hispanics in the United States. White Hispanics going back to what? The Tejanos? You see a lot of baseball players that have names like Sanchez, only they have blonde hair and blue eyes. Okay. Hello to Texas. Feral Hog. 1961 was the peak of TV, it says Professor Pohl. I don't know. I watch, some of these old shows. The comedies are pretty dire. People were pretty easily entertained in those days. You watch a show like My Three Sons and you think, this show is about 24 minutes long, and how many jokes are there in it? Not very many. Not very many at all. Anwar says, Tucker Carlson now uses the term anarcho-tyranny, which of course was coined by the great Sam Francis. Hello to Cognitive Dissonant. Let the West Coast burn as a warning to the rest of us, says Texas Feral Hog. Yeah, it's just access to the Pacific Ocean is pretty important. Perhaps if this state of Jefferson were to be created, then that would allow, access to the Pacific, to non-crazy America. Hello to Mary Crow and Caligula 138. Why say recognizance when you can just say will, says Buddy. Yes, let's go, Brandon. First mention of that on my live stream. I was hearing this phrase. What I heard that it's now, the meme is to get the PA, whoever running the PA at an airport, to ask for let's go, Brandon. It's like it's some sort of incomprehensible, Middle European name or whatever. But this is gone. It's gone so mainstream, so fast. Hello to a respectable commenting name. Good to see the KMG show back. Has he commented on the Canadian government and or CBC recognizing America rather than China as its a suzerain state with the banning of Let's Go Brandon from memos? I saw this. Apparently, the Canadian government has issued an instruction to its civil service that, those little messages that people put at the bottom of their emails, that colloquialisms, no, not allowed, especially Let's Go Brandon. It really is shocking for the American public to display as much hatred of a president as they have displayed to Joe Biden. But, like to like, and I guess unlike to unlike, right? Because whenever you see Joe Biden speak, I'm just waiting for him to just lose control and just start ranting against you stupid jerks. He's come close. He's come close. Hello to Jim Bowden. Oh, dear. I see a little bit of a fight breaking out here in the chat. over the idea of secular Coronism. You need a co-host, Kev, says D. Skiba. Yeah, I don't know. It's just troublesome for various reasons, not least of which I made it a rule for this show to be on the air, weekdays at 4 p.m. And it is difficult to arrange that, to get two people in the same time at the same place, same time. Again and again, hello to Avistula, a Viper. And let's get back to it here. And was it the great Enoch Powell said, "But a nation heaping up its own funeral pyre"? This is from the CBC yesterday. Starting this season, every Montreal Canadiens home game will open with a land acknowledgement in honor of local Indigenous peoples' contributions. And here is the statement. The Montreal Canadiens wish to acknowledge the unpronounceable name. I'm not even bothered to try to pronounce this because it's pronounceable, and it's just unpronounceable. It is just a form of humiliation. And I would guess that there are fewer than 1 in 10,000 Indians that can read these made-up languages. When I say made up, I mean that literally, because the Indians don't have written languages. Their languages are entirely oral, but white linguistics professors cobbled them together in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Also known as the Mohawk Nation, no, primarily known as the Mohawk Nation, actually, for their hospitality on this traditional and unceded territory where we are gathered today. And they use a name from Montreal that, again, no one knows and no one can pronounce, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Peoples. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within this community, where we have now had the privilege to play for over 100 years. Well, it is a fact that that North America, Canada, and the United States are European foundations. Full stop. I know that phrase irritates some people, but I'm quite fond of it. It's a powerful phrase. It's Europeans who created the social, economic, and other institutions of Canada and the United States. The Indians had nothing to do with it whatsoever. Zero. Canadian Indians were confined to their reserves until the year 1960. They were forbidden to leave their reserve without approval of the band manager. They did not even have the vote until 1960. Unceded land. Oh, I see. If you really believe that this land is unceded and it belongs to the unpronounceable name / Mohawk Nation, why don't you hand over the property and the team to the Mohawk? No, you're not going to do that. But the problem with this, which is almost universal in my country, at any public gathering, to grovel before about unceded territory, is that one day some judge is going to act on this. This is what you're seeing here. This is what it looks like when a country decides to commit suicide. David Amos, a longtime Conservative MP, was murdered on Friday by a Somali person, which the BBC and other news organizations tried to keep secret for as long as possible. I guess they had to get the narrative together, and the narrative is, now is not the time to inject politics into events like this. Well, when is the time? When Lee Rigby was hacked to pieces in London? All the other hacking incidents? How about the bombings in 2007? No, it's never the time. David Amos was, all accounts, a very kindly man, and he found himself embarrassed nationally in 1997 when Chris Morris, the savage satirist, on his Brass Eye program in an episode called Drugs, got an interview with David Amos and talked about the horrors of a new drug from the then Czechoslovakia called cake. And it's a standard trope, as all journalists or ex-journalists know, that every year or so there will be all these stories about a new drug which is worse than all the other drugs put together. And of course, I don't know, maybe fentanyl, it's true about that. But, you read these stories, and I've seen them in, publication I work for, essentially that, all the kids are taking this drug, and you take the drug and you want to put pencils into your eyes. Well, who would want to take a drug like that? In any event, David Amos was genuinely distressed at the pain and damage that this new made-up drug called cake was going to create. Of course, it was, as I say, all made up. There's a good piece by Tom Slater in Spiked. I don't know who needs to hear this, but nasty tweets, the alleged coarsening of political debate, or the salty insults of one Angela Rayner are not responsible for the murder of David Amos. Actually, you know what? I do know who needs to hear this, because in the wake of the barbaric murder of the much-loved Essex MP Friday, scores of politicians and commentators have been trotting out one or more of the above explanations and pretending that it's meaningful analysis. Everyone's at it. On the media round this morning, Home Secretary Priti Patel said she was considering removing the right to anonymity on social media to stop what she called the relentless abuse of MPs online. It was as if Amos was the victim of a particularly nasty Twitter storm rather than a deadly knife attack. Political debate has coarsened, writes Labour frontbencher Alison McGovern, pointing to the social media norms that have to change. The occasionally sensible Dan Hodges as an absolute howler in today's Mail on Sunday under the headline, "I don't know why Sir David Amos was killed, but the visceral hatred of Tories at the heart of Labour has to end right now." Deputy Labour leader Angela Rayner comes in for particular criticism for referring to the Tory government as scum a few weeks back. Hodges is at least right to say that we do not yet know the full story of why Amos was killed. But what we do know pretty much closes off most of the current philosophical avenues inexplicably being explored on Twitter and in the comment pages at the moment. Police arrested Ali Harbi Ali, a 25-year-old British man of Somali heritage, at the scene. The murder is being treated as a suspected terrorist incident with a potential Islamic motivation, and Ali is being detained under the Terrorism Act. Reportedly, he was referred to the PREVENT program years ago. Though little came of it, he appears to have been self-radicalized. One of the things I learned from reading the Daily Mail is that Ali's most recent address is in Kentish Town, London, which is one of the richest places on earth. And the British government delights in just rubbing the noses of British people in this. Let's get a bunch of refugees from salubrious places like Somalia and put them in some of the most beautiful and expensive places in our country. You couldn't afford to live in this place, even if you were employed. Even if you were earning, I don't know, £100,000 a year, you probably couldn't afford to live here. But these people do, because they're better than you, and they are the future, supposedly, of England and Britain. Speaking of England, a good piece in Unheard by Aris Rousinos, described as a former war reporter, contributing editor at Unheard. And it's about globalism and neoliberalism. Has any major political movement been as thoroughly expunged from popular memory as the anti-globalization movement? 2 decades ago, the dominant opinion on the left was that globalization was a destructive and exploitative innovation of international capitalism to be fought. In Seattle in 1999 and Genoa in 2001, thousands of protesters from across the world gathered to protest against the signing of the transnational trade treaties that accelerated the spread of globalization, cheered on by the organs of left opinion. A BBC article from 2001 notes that opponents of globalization believe, quote, it leads to exploitation of the world's poor, workers, and the environment, makes it easier for rich companies to act with less accountability, and that countries, individuals, cultures are becoming overpowered by Americanization, unquote. On the other hand, those in favor of globalization claim it should make everyone richer, while trade links can encourage countries to respect human rights. 20 years on, it is clear that the opponents of globalization were entirely correct and the supporters were utterly wrong. And yet their brains broken by Brexit, Britain's liberal commentariat continue to advocate globalized food supply chains purely as a result of Remainer tribalism. The BBC's neutral tone at the turn of the millennium is almost unimaginable in today's hysterical discourse, where opposition to globalization has been recoded as a political signifier entirely randomly, from a reasoned left-wing argument to an irrational prejudice of reactionary and probably racist deplorables. Likewise, the left has seemingly abandoned its commitment to localization and the preservation of unionized national labor in favor of cosmopolitan dreams of unfettered globalization. In Britain, this bizarre polar inversion is manifest in the political discourse over the current supply chain crisis. The fundamental problem causing empty shelves in Britain today is not Brexit itself, but the over-complexity of supply chains maximized for efficiency in good times, which are dangerously fragile whenever the system meets a shock. By over-attenuating supply chains on a global scale and centralizing food production for the benefit of the supermarkets, the system was unable to cope with the pandemic's cascading aftershocks, from energy crises to labor shortages still working themselves through the global economy. This is a global supply chain crisis caused by worldwide slow motion but accelerating collapse of globalization. As the American economist Matt Stoller underlines, globalization has left us uniquely unprepared to manage a supply shock. Our hyper-efficient globalized supply chain, once romanticized by men like Tom Friedman in The World is Flat, is the problem. Like the financial system before the 2008 crash, this kind of economic order hides its fragility. It seems to work quite well until it doesn't. Now we're beginning to see what it looks like when it doesn't. Take meat processing as an example. For decades, in search of efficiency, supermarkets have centralized the processing of meat into gigantic mega abattoirs, forcing small regional abattoirs to close and crowding out local farmers. The working environment in these places is so appalling and exploitative, and the pay so low, that they can only be staffed by immigrants from poorer regions of the world. As a result, more than 2/3 of Britain's meat processing labor force is made up of migrants, making the nation's food supply dependent on the free flow of foreign labor and on the nationwide distribution of live animals and processed meat to a tiny number of centralized hubs. This is entirely unsustainable as well as an immoral state of affairs. As the commentator Richard North, an expert on the meat industry, observes, the number of abattoirs in Britain has shrunk from 3,326 units in the 1960s to a mere 156 in 2020, with the result that the meat industry structure in the UK is already so concentrated as to be unsustainable. As soon as the system meets a shock, as it has now, it is unable to cope. As Christopher Price of the Rare Breed Survival Trust observes, large-scale abattoirs require workers to carry out highly specific, often highly mechanized procedures as part of the slaughtering process and employ relatively large numbers of narrower-skilled, lower-paid people in one location. Well, low prices and high profits, which is, I don't know, that was Conservatism Inc. That's what they were all about. Low prices and high profits. Never mind the carnage that is caused by this, by the destruction of community and of society. But it, again, echoing the author, it's remarkable for me to see the left chiming in on this. I guess they are just so addicted to high levels of immigration that large parts of the country becoming horror shows. Well, they're prepared to put up with it, because they just need the migrants. They need non-British people in Britain. As Greenpeace investigation revealed last week, the growing consolidation of Britain's dairy industry into a handful of American-style mega dairies is allowing global food corporations to feed cows soybeans sourced from Brazil's endangered Cerrado ecoregion. The impact has been profound as accelerated deforestation and global warming forced cows to live in miserable and unnatural indoors conditions in giant sheds and driven small dairy farmers here in Britain out of business. I've mentioned this before. There was a piece on American Thinker about this, but one of the results of the number of meat producers becoming ever smaller is that they are then in a position to jack up prices, such that you're going to have to learn how to eat the bugs and to love it, because meat will be for the 1%. Crisis is the new normal, and to sustain the very basic good of food security, Britain will have to become more self-reliant, decentralizing supply chains in pursuit of resilience rather than efficiency, and reshoring food production as far as it is possible. This isn't a leap back to the Middle Ages, as online critics howl. Britain was 78% self-sufficient in food as late as the 1980s, and returning to localized production and supply chains should be considered as a vital strategic goal. And yet, in a stunning example of cognitive dissonance, we see liberal commentators who warn of the looming catastrophe of climate collapse simultaneously arguing that fragile globalized supply chains are somehow both desirable and permanent. Like the famous quote that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, it seems it's easier for these people to imagine total civilizational collapse than not being able to eat Kenyan strawberries in midwinter. The global supply chain crisis is forcing the conservatives to abandon their free trading dreams as neoliberal ideology gets crushed by stark reality. This is an unalloyed good and should be supported and encouraged as far as possible. The government is correct to say that today's supply chain meltdown is a failure of the free market and not of the state, and that businesses have become drunk on cheap labor. The current crisis is an opportunity to rebalance Britain's food system into a fairer and more resilient model, and the government, finally being forced towards good policy by events outside its control, needs to hold its nerve. Also, from Unheard, which is an online publication I highly recommend, there is an essay by the English historian Dominic Sandbrook from 2 days ago. I reviewed several of his books. Most recently, Who Dares Wins, Britain, 1979 to 1982. I cannot recommend his books highly enough, because when he examines Britain from the end of the Second World War or so, and he's moving towards the present, he doesn't just look at the macro picture, he looks at the micro picture as well. Many set pieces of all aspects of life. And obviously, it's a mistake to consider the history of a country or just how we live today by let's look at the GDP and where the Dow Jones is at, or what the unemployment figures are. Obviously, there's much more to life than that, and Sandbrook has all of it in his books. Is Boris taking us back to the 70s? He asks. Inflation is snowballing. To stop it would take years of pain. And I suppose most people in Britain have forgotten what happened there in the 1970s. Life in the summer of 1975, the age of Show Waddy Waddy, 10cc, and the Bay City Rollers. Harold Wilson was PM. Tom Baker was in his time-traveling pomp. Britain had just voted to remain in the common market, and the space hopper was the fashion accessory du jour. And all the time, inflation just kept rising. 24%, 25%, 26%. Today, the prospect of prices soaring at such breakneck speed seems like something from some mad fantasy. Yet inflation is back in the news, and understandably so. The Bank of England's target is 2%. The most recent figure for the year to August shows inflation at 3%, and most analysts expect it to hit 4% before the end of the year. As always, the causes are very complicated. The explosive recovery of the world economy after COVID, the global supply chain crisis, the huge surge in demand for fossil fuels, the spike in wholesale gas prices up 250% incredibly, since the turn of the year. The rise in shipping costs because of container shortages, the worldwide scarcity of semiconductors, the dearth of lorry drivers, Brexit Boris, who pays your money and takes your choice, basically. By the standards of the 70s, inflation of 4% doesn't sound like much. In the summer of 1975, Britain's Chancellor Dennis Healey would have sobbed with joy if you had offered him an inflation rate of 14%, let alone 4%. But as Healey would also have told you, 4% can become 6% very quickly. Then consumers' expectations kick in and 6% becomes 8%. Wages leap to follow prices, 8% becomes 10%. And with interest rates following suit, good luck paying your mortgage. I wonder about that. I made a prediction a little more than a decade ago, which is held true, and I believe it will continue to hold true, that ZERP is permanent, effectively zero interest rates. Why? Because if interest rates rise significantly, the world economy will collapse in short order. Because this money which is being borrowed, the money which is being created and helicoptered, it is never going to be paid back. And this is a warning from Sandbrook. You know, politicians at first, they like inflation because it means that their debts are less important, and inflation is, politicians typically consider it to be better than austerity, because it was Margaret Thatcher who crushed inflation in Britain, just as it was Ronald Reagan and Paul Volcker who crushed inflation in the United States. There was great pain involved. Millions and millions of people losing their jobs. But I remember in the 1970s, and you can read about this in Sandbrook's book, or you can see it in documentaries, that such was the chaos caused by inflation in Britain and the ongoing war between governments and unions, that people were talking about a military coup or the like, or revolution. This was serious talk. It was not hysterical talk. And of course, worse than that, I suppose, you can have a Zimbabwe experience, or a Weimar Republic experience, which you don't want, obviously. Yes, the disease which must not be named. This is just, even for the Canadian media and Canadian politicians, this is disgusting. This is from Wallace Snowden at the CBC. Alberta's reporting of comorbidities questioned after boy 14 removed from COVID-19 death count. 9 months after being diagnosed with a stage 4 brain tumor, and 2 days after his family says he tested positive for COVID-19, Nathaniel Spitzer of Ponoka, Alberta, died in hospital. When Dr. Dina Hinshaw, she is Alberta's chief latrine walla, told Albertans earlier this week that the 14-year-old had died of COVID-19, the province's chief medical officer of health triggered a wave of controversy over how coronavirus deaths are reported. Hinshaw told a news conference Tuesday that the boy had complex pre-existing medical conditions that contributed to his death. Her comments renewed a debate surrounding Alberta's practice of reporting on comorbidities. The boy's family publicly called on Hinshaw to retract her statement, suggesting that Nathaniel had died of cancer, not COVID-19. Simone Spitzer accused the province of spreading fake news about her younger brother, who had been in hospital since August. We just want the truth to come out, as she said. On Thursday, at another news conference, Hinshaw apologized to the family. She said that while an initial report had indicated that COVID-19 was a secondary cause of the teen's death, a subsequent review determined that not to be the case. Hinshaw announced the province will no longer report COVID-19 deaths of children until a review process has been completed to confirm the actual cause of death. The case highlights the intricacies of reporting a comorbidity such as cancer, diabetes, hypertension, and dementia that can contribute to the dangers of COVID-19. Alberta started reporting comorbidities linked to COVID-19 deaths in December 2020, but the data doesn't tell the whole story. Experts say discussing the statistics without nuance can minimize dangers of the disease. The CBC got into serious trouble over this issue just a few weeks ago, because one of their reporters had mocked a UCP MLA, who had pointed out that 91% of the people who died in Alberta of the disease that must not be named had comorbidities, but apparently not important. The most important comorbidities listed in Alberta are hypertension, 83%, cardiovascular diseases, 52%, renal diseases, 50%, diabetes, 45%, respiratory diseases, 40%, and dementia, 40%. But let's go to the experts. Dr. Noel Gibney, Professor Emeritus in the Department of Critical Care Medicine at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, says reporting on pandemic deaths is complex, and the data can easily be misunderstood. I guess that's why we're constantly being bashed over the head with numbers of cases, numbers of hospitalizations, numbers of deaths. Gibney, who expressed sympathy for the Spitzer family, that's decent of him, also noted that COVID-19 can trigger myriad lesser-known potentially fatal heart issues such as a heart attack or a stroke. So apparently they're not important. That's the line. Why are you talking about this? This is a distraction. Now, you may have noticed that in a lot of these stories, I wish I'd had the vaccine. And if they include a picture of the man or woman who has succumbed, these people are morbidly obese, often shockingly so, but apparently that is not important. Not important at all. Ubaka Ogbogu, an associate professor in the Faculty of Law and the Katz Research Fellow in Health Law and Science Policy at U of A, said Alberta's comorbidities reporting system should be scrapped. This disclosure started a long time ago, and it started from the time that Premier Kenney really wanted to minimize COVID in general, as well as COVID deaths. People who have these comorbidities are going to live in fear. Well, it seems to me that if you weigh twice as much as you should, you probably should be living in fear. And that anxiety is not being matched by any action from these governments to actually show that they're trying to protect those who are especially vulnerable. Oh, this fellow who calls himself Eugippius at Substack, the outstanding work, is an essay from October 15th. I cannot quote much, but I will quote this because it's really crucial, and it's not something that's being talked about. Overuse of ventilators caused many early deaths, but it's worth considering if there are not also other subtler ways that our suppression policies enhance corona as well. More than anything else, and like MERS and SARS-1 before it, SARS-2 wants to be in institutions. It is a disease of hospitals and nursing homes, and until it gets into those places, its potential to inflict damage is, I can't repeat that. How many people end up in hospitals and other medical facilities as a byproduct of our strange desire to tabulate every last case, people who would have never come to the attention of our health systems otherwise? And then there are the broader health consequences of keeping the vast majority of everyone indoors, where infection is more likely for months at a time. Again, to repeat, stay away from hospitals if at all possible. Because hospitals are dangerous places. They always have been. But I suppose especially now. And some depressing news from Germany, from the state of Hesse. This is from the local.de. Supermarkets in Frankfurt and the surrounding region can now implement rules that only allow vaccinated and COVID recovered people on to their premises. The new COVID health pass entry rules announced by the central state of Hesse have upped the pressure on the unvaccinated by allowing all shops to implement the so-called 2G rule at their doors. Now, there had been exceptions before for bars, restaurants, nightclubs, and cinemas, but apparently in Hesse this might end. And how did this come about? Was it the result of government pressure? No. Apparently, it was the businessmen themselves who have proposed this, which gives you an insight, I suppose, into the German mentality, or at least that of the state of Hesse. Of course, Colin Powell is dead at the age of 84. Alex Berenson says, just another rare, mild breakthrough case and the highest profile COVID death by far. I'm obligated to tell you that this is incredibly rare. It is so incredibly rare that I don't even know why we would mention it. This is what I'm obligated to tell you. As for Colin Powell himself, well, he played along with one of the great lies of the century, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. I suppose few people know this. He was eventually fired as Secretary of State. He could have used his influence and his popularity to stop this disaster from happening, but he didn't. And of course, he supported Obama in 2008 and 2012, despite the Republican Party elevating him to such great positions. Not a lot of loyalty there. I think Colin Powell is essentially, a company man, someone who wanted to get along, go along to get along, as they say, more than anything else. And let's see, what is it? 5:41 here. And I guess I'll leave Tainter for tomorrow. Strange piece in the Daily Mail. No woke deed goes unpunished. John Lewis is accused of sexism, gender ideology, and neatly repackaging patriarchy in glitter and rainbows in home insurance ad of boy dancing in his mother's clothes. I should point out that John Lewis is a name that, well, everyone knows in Britain. It's a chain of stores, homeware, fashion, electrical, and more. Well, it turns out they also sell insurance. Now, I've seen this ad, and it is truly horrifying. Truly so. John Lewis's woke new television advert featuring a young boy dancing in his mother's clothes, makeup, and jewelry has upset the very audience it had aimed to please because it's not woke enough. Viewers have taken offense at the High Street Giants ad and accused the retailer of sexism, misogyny, and gender ideology. The advert, named Let Life Happen, premiered during the Great British Bake Off Monday. It begins by showing a young boy in a messy bedroom filled with clothes and jewelry that has been dumped on the floor. The boy, who is wearing a dress over and large necklace over a t-shirt, then flings a pair of heeled shoes at a lamp and low-hanging light before running downstairs. This kid, who is, of course, of indeterminate ethnicity, dresses up as a drag queen and then goes around his house or apartment or whatever it is, destroying things. And we're all meant to think that this is just so delightful because we want boys. And what was this kid? This kid looks like he's 5 or 6 years old to dress up as a drag queen and to wreck things because it is so fierce, as the alphabet people like to say. Francis Wheatman said the John Lewis advert of a young boy being the center of attention for trashing everything while his sister obediently sits and paints in a corner is sexism encapsulated in 60 seconds. I do not understand this comment or women like her. Maybe his sister likes to paint. Why does this have to be obedient? Is the suggestion there that his sister would have preferred to get in on the action, to smear paint all over himself and start wrecking things? Opinions on the John Lewis Home Insurance Let Life Happen advert. I saw sexualization of a male child imitating OTT feminized posturing, who was also acting like a bully and a vandal. This is depravity, pure and simple. And don't pretend, oh no, after Desmond is amazing, and a different case, which an 11-year-old boy was the marshal of the Gay Pride Parade in Los Angeles a couple of years ago, there is no question that certain men certain type of man, has a sexual interest in little boys who dress up as girls. Now, not that long ago, we would have had frenzied denials. No, this is outrageous. This will not stand. We're going to put an end to this Desmond is amazing nonsense because it makes us look bad. But they're silent now. And that tells you everything. A John Lewis spokesman told Mail Online, our advert is a dramatic fictional story showing a main character getting carried away and dancing to his favorite song, unaware of the unintentional consequences of his actions and does not show willful damage. Bollocks. If customers have accidental damage cover with our home insurance, this would cover a range of major and minor home disasters, which includes unintentional breakages caused by children in the family. These are not unintentional breakages. Shambolic Woltral, I stand with Kathleen Stock, who's a university professor in Britain who is being persecuted unto death because she refuses to I believe she's a lesbian herself. She refuses to bow down to the wildest demands of the trans people. It's very telling about that John Lewis advert that even when presenting gender ideology in as adorable a way possible, it's still revealed to be narcissistic, destructive, aggressive, and misogynist, and think women and girls exist to sit quietly and take whatever crap it pulls. Of course, the Daily Mail has many, many stills from this. The boy then spins and sways his way into the kitchen, leaving painted handprints on his way and knocking over a glass of liquid before throwing glitter around the room while standing on top of a dining room table. Glitter. This is significant. I learned that from the woman who wrote, Abigail Schreier, who wrote Irreversible Damage. This term, glitter family, it exists. It's a real thing. And it's something that millions of people in America know now. That, of course, people who come out as trans, as teenagers or even earlier, this very often, or in most cases, causes turmoil in the family and often a breakdown of the family. And sometimes the trans kids, they feel guilty about this. They are advised by their elders that they should not feel guilty about this at all, that they should be pleased, that they should celebrate, that they have abandoned their fake families and have joined their real family, which is the glitter family. Again, I am not making this up. How much ruin is there in a nation? But to find out really soon, Victoria Richards in The Independent says the new John Lewis advert is a glorious antidote to toxic boys will be boys messaging. Is it now? Is it now? People have already worked themselves into a collective frenzy about the new John Lewis advert. The marketing team must be delighted. Not only is all publicity good publicity, but now we're talking about home insurance, thinking about breakages, shuddering as we imagine and relate to the havoc wreaked in the minute-long ad, which shows a young boy of about 7 or 8 gleefully stomping around the house in lipstick, a pair of heels, and a dress 3 sizes too big, scattering glitter and turning over lamps. Some appear to absolutely hate the concept. One writer even described the ad as triggering. I relate to that bit because of the glitter. One play date 2 months ago, and my kitchen table still sparkles like the night sky. But while I sympathize with those who cringe as they identify with the chaos that having kids brings into a family home and wince when I see the boy place 2 small hands covered in paint on the wall, I think we're all missing the point because the ad is joyful. Just look at him, the dazzling star, an actor, of course, but still a role model for so many boys who wish they too could copy their sisters without condemnation, wear a tutu and princess heels and strut to the strains of Stevie Nicks. There's something terribly wrong with women today. I have the TV on in my hotel room. I don't watch much of it, but I will see ads and promos, a lot of promos. And I have this question. How many drag shows are there on TV now? How many? Also, don't women realize that these shows are mocking them? And what about that old jibe about, costume not being culture? There's such a surfeit of this now that I expect that 2021 is going to be the year of the great drag queen crash, where penniless drag queens will be out begging on the street, promising to do something fierce for a few coins. So this woman, Victoria Richards, in The Independent, her only problem with this advert, seemingly, is that her rates might go up as a result. We've seen how harmful stereotyping starts early, and if we want to combat systemic societal issues such as misogyny and toxic masculinity, we need to look at where they first become embedded and challenge them. And I would say I do not want this woman anywhere near children, especially boys. This kid in the advert, how many years before he first attempts suicide? This is from Dan Hastings in the Daily Express. Kerry Johnson supports trans rights at Tory conference fringe event. Long way to go. Kerry Johnson has backed the trans inclusive wing of the Tories while guest speaking at a fringe event organized by the Alphabet People Conservatives group. Who elected this dim-witted bint to anything? The rumors have it that Boris is absolutely terrified of her, and that the real policy from 10 Downing Street is coming from her and not from her husband. And this is a warning to men about having a zipper problem. That this woman has him over a barrel now. Johnson has been famous for, picking charming women, sexing them up, and then discarding them like so much used tissue. But he cannot do this with Kerry Johnson, and she clearly knows it. And, let's hear from Jon Stewart. Anyone still interested in him? This is from Joe DiPaolo at Mediaite. Jon Stewart delivered a scathing critique of the media on CNN Sunday, appearing with Jake Tapper. He accused the Fourth Estate of overhyping stories in order to stir up conflict. Of course, the media, or the press as we used to call it, never done that. Do any of you find it richly ironic that these sanctimonious hypocrites are it is the high point of their career to receive a Pulitzer Prize from journalists? Well, Pulitzer was the yellowest of the yellow journalists. And he talks about things that are not important that the media is interested in. Tapper earlier in the segment had asked Stewart about a new bill signed into law by Governor Gavin Newsom of California requiring toy stores in the Golden State to have gender-neutral sections. Stewart believes it's a non-story receiving outsized coverage because the media wants to gin up a debate. Honestly, like that law, who gives a shit, Stewart said. Well, I do, and so should he. Who was upset about, one side of the aisle, toys for boys, and then toys for girls? Who was upset about that? Who thought that it was a necessity that the state must interfere and say, no, you can't have that anymore because, why? Because it is wicked? Why don't they just mix all the men's clothing and the women's clothing together? Because it's kind of a hateful binary division, isn't it? No, I prefer this, and I'm sure women prefer it, because I don't have to waste a lot of time looking at clothing that was not made for me. And I don't want to talk about Billy Porter. Black culture seems to be disappearing in the United States and being replaced by homosexual culture. I can't be the only person who has noticed this. Oh, and the Sunday Times, which is a newspaper which is just 60 years old. I suppose it was always kind of sensationalist, but now it is a joke. This was their lead story, at least their lead story on social media on this Sunday. Bimini Bon Boulash, trans people aren't a threat to you. She looks rather threatening. We sit down with the star of RuPaul's Drag Race to talk about drag, gender, and self-acceptance. Trans people aren't a threat to you. I want people to see others as human and being accepting of each other. Katie Gayton sits down with Bimini Babes, non-binary star of RuPaul's Drag Race UK and Great Yarmouth's most fabulous export. Bimini Bon Boulash doesn't like labels. Non-binary is a new term, but the idea has been around for a long time, the 28-year-old drag queen says. Oh, and let's get to pronouns, because they're the most important thing. Bimini is the drag persona of Thomas Hibbets. Hibbets goes by the pronouns they, them, whereas Bimini uses she, her, though she says she's pretty easygoing about the whole thing. Looking at these pictures of this creature does not appear to be easygoing about anything. Nothing whatsoever. And of course, here's another female journalist gushing over a woman, or a person, a man, actually. I can say that. A man and a movement which seeks to make a joke out of the very idea of being female. And in that line, this is from Mary Harrington at the American Mind, who I have quoted many times. She writes for Unheard. The fight against erasing women. Conservatives and feminists must unite against technocratic effacement. Gender Acceleration, a Black Paper, is an anonymous 2018 essay that celebrates an imagined escape from the, quote, horrid curse of being human. It describes a tech-enabled unmooring of gender from reproduction that ultimately, it hopes, will enable us to triumph over our own nature. Quote, trans women are techno-capital producing itself outwardly into increasingly multitudinous configurations. Trans women, as we know them now, are the melding of techno-capital with the human race and the expropriation of it towards its own ends. Their flesh is how the machinery beneath infiltrates the human race. It breaks these lucky few free from the horrid curse of being human towards the lesbian auto-production of demons. Sounds great, right? The downward cascade of gender fragmentation away from the binary and ultimately away from the human itself is presented as an ultimate feminist victory, the dissolution of all constraint, and thus of even the residual masculinity contained in the abstract principle of order. Gender acceleration may be lurid, but it's little more than a hyperbolic restatement of mainstream intersectional feminist doctrine. This doctrine has embraced as a key feminist aim the need to unmoor woman as an identity from biological givens. Emancipation looks like surgically feminized males celebrated as Woman of the Year, while real females are celebrated for intentional childlessness. This is a literal realization of gender acceleration's vision, the feminine untethered from the reproductive logic of humanism, with femininity no longer in the service of the male as a machine to produce the future. I have spoken in the past, I've given 2 cheers for intersectionalism because it means the destruction of the left. We see, specifically in Britain and probably elsewhere as well, that civil war has broken out amongst the alphabet people. In fact, there has been a move to purge the T from LGBT with the formation of I believe it's called the LGB Alliance in Britain. That you can be whatever you like. You say that you were this thing and you are this thing. Well, a lot of male homosexuals and lesbians are deeply upset about this because, with all this talk about erasure, this is essentially what we're talking about here. And Abigail Schreier talks about this in her book. What we're seeing is the erasure of lesbianism. When I first came across this opposition to the so-called TERFs, although I don't know that the term had been invented or I had been introduced to it, I realized what was happening here. It was an attempt by certain people to bully women, lesbian women, into having sex with them. You must do this. It is your duty. Are you going to be a mean person? And I thought, this is exactly what a group of men would do. But of course, they don't see the irony in that. Mary Harrington concludes, for individual and family life, biorealism is a profoundly conservative and also feminist project. But at the political scale, it's assertion of human limits on the entitlement of an emerging bio-tyranny to mold us according to its whims. If we do not want to be terraformed, this unlikely alliance must make a stand for human nature. And I thought I'd conclude by talking about the greatly anticipated first episode of season 3 of HBO's Succession. I suppose there's going to be some spoilers here, but there's not a lot that actually happens in the first episode of the third season, because it's setting up what's going to happen in the rest of the season. We all know how season 2 ended with Kendall shockingly denouncing his father as a monster and criminal at a press conference. I've written about how brilliant I think that Jeremy Strong is in his portrayal of Kendall Roy. And we saw some of this last night. It's a shame that, there's nothing in his life between manic exhilaration and muleless depression. There's never any kind of happy medium. We've seen him be happy on drugs. This does not work out very well for him. And of course, we see that he has hooked up again with the member of the Pierce family, a cute blonde who is Rockstar's daughter from Foreigner. And he should not be with this woman. But it was really brought home to me watching the first episode, which is called Secession, that Kendall Roy is not fit to run a public company. He's simply not fit. He's very intelligent and he's hardworking, and he knows a lot about the media business, and he knows a lot, especially about Waystar Royco. But he is irrational. He is dangerous. He is not balanced. And perhaps more to the point, he can just never seal the deal. When we're looking at his declaration of war against his father, you wouldn't have to go very far back in his life. Just all these terribly embarrassing incidents, including one which, of course, has been kept secret. And perhaps this season it will not be kept secret. But how could you take seriously a man who was just doing groveling duties for his father for the longest time? Oh, and then he announces that, oh, no, I'm part of a takeover bid, an attempted internal takeover of investors. Oh, but I'm blowing that off because my father's plan was better. And now he's switched sides again. But there was one shocking moment in yesterday's episode where Kendall was so pleased with himself that Greg, who was amusing as ever, especially his troubles with the internet and Twitter. Do you know that there's an awful lot of opinions on Twitter? I mean, it's really hard to keep up with them. There are so many of them. But at the high point of the episode, I guess, was when Greg, after Kendall had become the most famous man in America, well, not America, at least New York City, or at least Wall Street, and the media is trying to chasing after him everywhere, and Greg is rather excited, and he says, this is just like OJ. If OJ had never killed anyone. And Kendall has a big smile on his face and says, "Who said I never killed anyone?" And then to make it worse, the juice is loose. I don't think he's going to keep up this high for much longer. One of the problems I had with the first episode was, okay, so the Roy family, they find themselves in Sarajevo, and there's a whole bunch of other very strange places that they could fly to, because they seem to have 2 or 3 private aircraft at their beck and call at all times. And there was an offhand reference to this being because there was no extradition treaty between these places and the United States. And I think they needed to hammer that home a little harder, because Sarajevo, why would they go to Sarajevo? And again, I think they could have done more with that. I was kind of pleased that when I was talking about season 1, what was that, 3 years ago? This question of, who was going to succeed Logan Roy when it looked like he'd been crippled permanently by his stroke. I said something like, why don't they let Jerry run the company? She seems to know what she's doing. And now she is going to be running the company, well, at least temporarily. But of course, one gets the impression that this is not going to end well for her. I suppose it's not a Frank's character on the show. It's not a big character, but I always like seeing him, because this is always a reminder of just how much humiliation people will endure for a paycheck. I mean, you remember that, he's supposed to be showing Romulus the ropes, and Romulus was not interested in learning about ropes or interested in learning about anything. And Logan keeps telling him, "We don't trust you," and then screaming at him to F off and the like. But, he's got that nice paycheck. I always wish for more information about money in shows of this kind, because, it would be useful to know exactly how much money Frank is earning. I mean, like, what is his price, as I say, for the endless humiliation? But of course, you see that Jesse Armstrong, the creator of this show, he's English, and he's associated with the Armando Iannucci wing of British comedy, from which we get the thick of it, and Veep, the HBO series. And the whole premise of those series is that politics is about humiliation. But these politicians, they put up with it, they seek it out, they suck it up, actually, because of their belief that one day I will be on top. And of course, there's only one person could be on top at any one time. And of course, many of these people are just absolutely, completely, I don't know. They have little sense of reality. We were introduced again to Kendall's ex-wife, Rava. I do not like this woman. I suppose it could be a little unfair because we didn't see them as a couple. And when Kendall was in the throes of his cocaine addiction, but she's like January Jones in Mad Men. She just sucks all the energy out of a room. She has no scruples about exploiting her husband for any reason whatsoever. And this bit with this old bottle of wine that she got from her godfather, how dare you open that bottle of wine? It had dust on it. Didn't you notice all the dust on it? Well, if it was such a very special bottle of wine, and apparently the point of it was not to drink it, perhaps you should have put it in a place that is not with all the other bottles of wine that people would think are there to drink. Of course, one might argue, what is Kendall doing? Plotting his coup from his ex-wife's apartment. Of course, this woman, this Rava, her son, I don't know whether it's her natural son or whatever, is an absolute monster. And she seems to be quite not put out by that. But on the other hand, whenever I get too sympathetic towards Kendall, I have to remind myself that he named his son Iverson. Yes, after the basketball player. So, I'm very much looking forward to the rest of season 3. Let's have a final look at the chat. Rava, is she from Finland? No, says Anne Run, not to the best of my knowledge. I guess it's just an exotic name. She seems to be ethnically indeterminate as well. I lost my job because I refused being humiliated, said Dionysius. I don't know, my last, year and a half at the Report magazine. I couldn't quit. I couldn't quit because I had 3 children and their mother to support. People find themselves in that situation. Hello to Schizo Rick, a.k.a. Quantrell Bishop. Okay. Hello to Judas Fly Chai and Ogan's Iron. Ogan's Iron says definitely anti-turf is a bunch of guys given the right to pick fights with women. I can't. I'm really all that fond of lesbians, but just the outrageous bullying. Oh, you want your safe spaces? These are our spaces now. And we're going to tell you what it's like to be a woman. Yikes. True Greenbird says the alphabet people are all the same category to me, and that includes the so-called straight allies. Ogan's Iron says the KMG baffling proof that there are no races or ethnic groups naturally immune to pause. Jamaicans are famously anti-alphabet. Sooner or later, they'll get broken too. True Greenberg says a large part of black culture overlaps with gay culture. The sassy gay voice is indistinguishable from the sassy black lady voice. Isn't that weird? Though Dave Chappelle has noticed it. Yes, the effacement, one might say, of black culture by alphabet people culture. Hello to Cognitive Dissonant, and I think I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you all for putting up with me and showing up tonight. It means a lot to me. I will be back on the air. Hopefully. I don't think I said anything ban-worthy today, but again, I'm going to look further into this Odyssey business because I can't, as I mentioned, I cannot, for various reasons, allow YouTube to be my primary mode of expression because, they've just eventually banned me anyway. And it is galling to be forced to say, not to say what one believes, or even worse, to say the opposite of what one believes. So I'll be back tomorrow. Thank you all for tuning in. If you like the show, well, I suppose you could click on the like button. If you would like to make a donation to this show, which, as I say, I have this sword of Damocles hanging over my head again, and I would be so grateful. My PayPal account is linked to Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. Once again, Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. If you're in Canada, donations to the live stream may be made directly via Interact at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection to ease the burden. Good night.